The bright studio lights cast a harsh glow on the sleek glass table as the cameras rolled, beaming a live broadcast to millions of American homes. The network's highest-rated political debate show, The American Pulse, had promised fireworks tonight. After all, its host, Graham Holbrook, was known for his aggressive interview style, especially when he had conservative guests in the hot seat. And tonight, he had a big one. Sitting across from him was Vice President J.D. Vance, the man who had defied expectations at every turn. A former Marine, best-selling author, and the voice of working-class America, Vance had risen to power alongside President Donald Trump, bringing his no-nonsense, populist approach to Washington. Holbrook, a sharp-featured man with slicked-back hair, leaned forward, his smirk barely concealed. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "You have been accused of peddling dangerous populism, a rhetoric that some say appeals to emotion rather than facts. Do you truly believe that the American people are better off under your leadership?" Vance leaned back in his chair, his blue eyes steady, unfazed by the loaded question. "Let me ask you something, Graham," he said, his voice calm but firm. "When's the last time you set foot in Ohio or Kentucky outside of a campaign tour? When's the last time you actually talked to the people who built this country?" Holbrook chuckled dismissively. "Oh, come on, Mr. Vice President, let's not resort to it." "I'm not resorting to anything," Vance interrupted, his voice unwavering. "You sit here in a New York studio looking down at the same people whose taxes pay for these cameras, these microphones, this entire production. And yet you claim I'm the one who appeals to emotion rather than facts." A hush fell over the studio. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. The audience, a mix of political analysts and hand-picked guests, shifted in their seats. Holbrook opened his mouth, but Vance wasn't finished. "You want facts?" Vance continued. "Fine. Let's talk facts. Since taking office, real wages for working-class Americans have increased for the first time in decades. Manufacturing jobs, the ones that politicians in this very city claimed were never coming back, have returned. We've secured our borders, reduced crime in major cities, and put an end to endless foreign wars that benefit Washington elites but cost our soldiers their lives. Those aren't emotions, Graham. Those are facts." Holbrook's smirk faltered. The teleprompter in front of him continued scrolling, but for once he seemed unsure of what to say. "Interesting," he finally muttered. "But surely you must acknowledge that." "No, Graham," Vance interjected again, his voice growing sharper. "What I acknowledge is that for too long, the American media, people like you, have controlled the narrative. You tell people in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan that they should just accept globalization. That their factories closing was inevitable. That the border crisis is a manufactured problem. But when we fight back and prove you wrong, suddenly we're the ones being dangerous." The studio remained silent. Even the panelists, normally eager to jump in with counterpoints, seemed hesitant. Holbrook cleared his throat, his fingers tightening on his pen. "Well, Vance raised a hand, silencing him once more. "The real question isn't whether my policies are working. The real question is why you and your colleagues refuse to admit that America is better off under this administration." Holbrook's face twitched, his usual confidence shaken. The producers in the control room exchanged nervous glances. For the first time in a long time, it seemed the arrogant journalist had finally met his match. The silence stretched uncomfortably in the studio. The usual rhythm of the American Pulse, where the host dictated the tempo and guests scrambled to keep up, had been disrupted. J.D. Vance wasn't playing by Holbrook's rules. Holbrook shifted in his seat, trying to regain his footing. He was a veteran in media warfare, and he knew he couldn't afford to let Vance dominate the discussion. "Mr. Vice President," he said, his voice now measured, "you paint a picture of economic revival, but many economists argue that your administration's policies have contributed to inflation. Would you like to address the actual numbers?" Vance's lips curled into a slight smile. "Gladly." He clasped his hands together, leaning slightly forward. "Since you brought up actual numbers, let's look at them. Inflation was skyrocketing before we even took office. It was fueled by reckless spending and supply chain disruptions that no one in Washington wanted to address. The moment we stepped in, we took decisive action, cut unnecessary regulations, increased domestic energy production, and revitalized American industries." Holbrook interrupted, "But the inflation rate." "The inflation rate," Vance said firmly, cutting him off, "has been steadily decreasing since our policies took effect. That's a fact. You can spin it, twist it, and cherry-pick data, but working Americans know the difference when they see more money in their pockets. You ever try buying groceries in Ohio lately, Graham?" Holbrook hesitated. His job was to be in the newsroom, not in the checkout line of a Midwest supermarket. Vance seized the moment. Of course you haven't. Because if you had, you'd realize that families can actually afford to put food on the table again. You want to know who really drove up inflation? The very same economists who sit in their ivory towers writing op-eds about why the average American should tighten their belts while they sip lattes in Washington, D.C. Holbrook's jaw tightened. So you're blaming experts for it? Yes, Vance said without hesitation. Because their expertise is what got us into this mess. They ignored real Americans while making decisions that only benefited coastal elites. You know, the ones that fund networks like yours. A few gasps rippled through the audience. Even some of the producers watching from the control booth raised their eyebrows. Holbrook had debated plenty of Republican figures before, but he had never been confronted this directly. Mr. Vice President, Holbrook said, forcing a chuckle to lighten the mood, it seems you enjoy blaming the media and experts for all of America's problems. But surely there must be some accountability on your side. Vance leaned back again, his gaze unwavering. Of course. We've made mistakes and we'll own up to them. But unlike the people you defend, we don't bury our failures under bureaucratic reports and biased news coverage. We fix them. Holbrook scoffed. That's quite a bold claim. It's the truth. Vance crossed his arms. Your problem, Graham, is that you've spent too much time in TV studios and not enough time in the real world. You don't understand the people you pretend to speak for. You mock their struggles, dismiss their values, and then act surprised when they stop trusting you. Holbrook opened his mouth to respond, but Vance wasn't done. You want to talk about bold claims? Here's one for you. Vance turned toward the cameras. The American people are done with the media's gaslighting. They're tired of being told that things are bad when their own lives are improving. They're tired of being scolded for loving their country, for believing in hard work, for wanting security for their families. Holbrook quickly glanced at his producers for direction, but they had no answers. The audience remained unusually quiet, not out of disinterest, but because the vice president had them hooked. Vance leaned in once more. You see, Graham, for years, people like you have dictated what's acceptable political discourse. You shape narratives that serve your interests. But let me tell you something, America isn't listening to you anymore. They're listening to us. The weight of his words hung in the air. Holbrook swallowed hard. For the first time in his career, it seemed like he wasn't just losing control of an interview, he was losing the entire room. The tension in the studio was thick, the silence deafening. Graham Holbrook, the seasoned journalist who had built his career on putting high-profile politicians in the hot seat, found himself struggling to maintain control. Across from him, Vice President J.D. Vance sat cool and composed, delivering facts with the precision of a seasoned fighter landing punch after punch. Holbrook exhaled sharply, forcing a chuckle. Mr. Vice President, let's step away from broad rhetoric and focus on specifics. Your administration has faced sharp criticism for its stance on immigration. Many Americans, particularly those in border states, have expressed concerns over what they call inhumane policies. What do you say to those who believe your approach is too extreme? Vance didn't miss a beat. Extreme? He asked, raising an eyebrow. You want to talk about extreme? Let's talk about what's actually happening at our border. Fentanyl overdoses are now the leading cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 45. Cartels are trafficking women and children like commodities. And the federal government, for years, did nothing. The only thing extreme was letting it happen. Holbrook's expression hardened. Surely you can acknowledge that cracking down too harshly could harm innocent migrants seeking a better life. Vance's tone didn't waver. No one is against legal immigration, Graham. But you know who is against unchecked illegal immigration? The legal immigrants who actually did it the right way. You think it's fair to them? You think it's fair that they worked hard, waited in line, obeyed our laws only to watch others break those same laws and get rewarded for it? Holbrook tried to interrupt, but Vance pressed on. You sit here in your comfortable studio and call our policies inhumane. You want to know what's inhumane? Open border policies that encourage families to send their kids on a dangerous journey exploited by smugglers and traffickers. That's what's inhumane. The audience was dead silent. Even the control room, where producers normally whispered instructions into Holbrook's earpiece, had gone eerily quiet. Holbrook tapped his pen against the table, his frustration showing. So you're saying there's no room for compassion in your immigration policies? Vance shook his head. Compassion isn't turning a blind eye to lawlessness. Compassion is securing the border so American families and legal immigrants don't have to pay the price for Washington's failures. Compassion is making sure every American has a safe neighborhood to raise their kids in. Holbrook's smirk returned, albeit weaker than before. Well, Mr. Vice President, your rhetoric may work for some, but let's address another major issue, your administration's stance on global affairs. Critics argue that your America First policies are alienating our allies. Are you not concerned that this isolationism will weaken America's influence? Vance sighed, shaking his head slightly. Graham, you're proving my point. You and your colleagues in the media love using words like isolationism whenever we put American interests first. Tell me, was it isolationist when Germany refused to increase its NATO defense spending while relying on the U.S. military? Was it isolationist when we stopped funding foreign wars that drained our economy? Holbrook opened his mouth, but Vance wasn't done. You see, the problem isn't that we're isolating America. The problem is that for decades, our leaders put other nations ahead of us. And now, when we finally say, hey, maybe we should prioritize our own people for a change, the media calls it dangerous. Holbrook's face twitched. But don't you think America benefits from strong global alliances? Of course, Vance said without hesitation. But strong alliances are based on mutual respect, not America being the world's piggy bank. If our allies want a partnership, great. But if they expect endless handouts, then that's not an alliance, that's dependence. A slow murmur rippled through the studio. Holbrook, for the first time in a long time, looked visibly rattled. Vance leaned back, folded his arms, and gave a knowing nod. So tell me, Graham, do you actually care about American strength? Or do you just care about making sure the old establishment stays in power? Holbrook had no immediate answer. The silence stretched on. The tension in the studio was almost unbearable. The usual power dynamic had shifted. Graham Holbrook, the seasoned journalist who prided himself on controlling interviews, now found himself on the defensive. Meanwhile, Vice President J.D. Vance sat firm, unwavering, his words cutting through media narratives like a knife through butter. Holbrook took a slow breath, trying to recalibrate. He wasn't going to let Vance dominate his show. Mr. Vice President, he began, forcing a smile, let's shift gears a bit. The Trump administration has been heavily criticized for what many call an attack on democracy itself. January 6th remains a stain on this nation's history. Do you? Vance interrupted, his tone sharp. Graham, let me stop you right there. Holbrook stiffened and used to being cut off so directly. I knew this was coming, Vance continued, his voice steady. Every time a conservative sits in this chair, you people bring up January 6th as if it's the only event in American history. Never mind the riots that burned cities to the ground in 2020. Never mind the politicians who encouraged that violence. No, you only care about one incident because it fits your narrative. Holbrook's grip tightened around his pen. Are you denying the seriousness of what happened that day? Not at all, Vance said. Violence is unacceptable. We've said it 1,000 times. But here's what you won't say, how many people from those 2020 riots were held without trial for years? How many politicians called it an insurrection when police stations were firebombed? Where was your outrage when businesses were destroyed and innocent people were attacked? Holbrook hesitated. He knew what Vance was doing, turning the question around, forcing him into a corner. He needed to regain control. Well, Mr. Vice President, surely you can understand that a violent attack on the U.S. Capitol. You mean protests that got out of control? Vance challenged. Because that's the language your network used for the riots in 2020. Mostly peaceful, remember that. Holbrook's mouth opened, then closed. Vance leaned in, his expression firm. See, Graham, this is why people don't trust the media anymore. You pick and choose which violence matters based on politics. You inflate one event while sweeping another under the rug. And the American people see it. That's why your ratings keep dropping, why trust in the press is at an all-time low. Holbrook chuckled nervously. So you're saying journalists like myself are responsible for the decline in trust? Yes, Vance said bluntly. You and every so-called journalist who pretends to be objective but is really just pushing an agenda. The silence in the studio stretched on. Even the audience, normally responsive, whether cheering or groaning, sat in stunned quiet. Holbrook glanced at his notes. This interview was spiraling out of his control and he needed to steer it back. Let's talk about the future, then, he said, shifting tactics. Polls show that younger voters are increasingly skeptical of conservative policies. How does your administration plan to appeal to them? Vance smirked. By telling them the truth. Holbrook frowned. And what exactly is the truth? That government isn't their friend, Vance said, his voice steady. That the politicians promising them free stuff are really just selling them control. That the same people telling them America is evil live in gated mansions and fly private jets. Holbrook scoffed. That sounds like populist rhetoric. No, Graham, Vance replied. That sounds like reality. The silence returned. The tension thickened. Holbrook's eyes darted toward the cameras, searching for some kind of reprieve. But there was none. Vance had taken control. Graham Holbrook's carefully constructed persona was crumbling before the nation's eyes. His usual confidence, bordering on arrogance, had been replaced by an unmistakable discomfort. He had expected J.D. Vance to be another conservative politician caught off guard, struggling to defend himself against loaded questions. Instead, the vice president had systematically dismantled every narrative Holbrook tried to push. Holbrook cleared his throat. He couldn't let this end on Vance's terms. He needed one last push, something to regain the upper hand. Mr. Vice President, he began, forcing a smirk, let's cut through the political theater. Many people believe that your administration represents a step backward for America, that instead of progress, you're bringing us back to a more divided, less inclusive era. How do you respond to those who say that your policies are not just conservative, but regressive? Vance let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Ah, there it is. The classic attack. When you can't argue on facts, you call us regressive. Holbrook folded his arms. Aren't you? Vance leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Holbrook's. Let me tell you what's actually regressive, Graham. Regretfully watching American families struggle while prioritizing foreign interests, that's regressive. Telling young people they'll never succeed unless the government holds their hand, that's regressive. Pushing policies that lead to more crime, more division, and less opportunity for working-class Americans, that's regressive. Holbrook shifted in his seat. You're avoiding the question. No, I'm answering it, Vance said firmly. You and your colleagues in the media love to talk about progress, but let's define what that actually means. Is it progress when crime skyrockets in our cities because of soft-on-crime policies? Is it progress when young men are told they're toxic just for being masculine? Is it progress when free speech is crushed because certain opinions make people uncomfortable? Holbrook inhaled sharply. That's not it. Because if that's your version of progress, Vance continued, cutting him off, then no, I'm not interested. The American people aren't interested. What we stand for is real progress that lifts people up rather than tearing them down. Progress that respects hard work, personal responsibility, and freedom. Holbrook tried one last desperate move. It sounds like you're just catering to your base. Vance smiled. No, Graham. I'm speaking to every American who's tired of being told they should feel guilty for loving their country. The studio was dead silent. For the first time in his career, Graham Holbrook had no comeback. No snarky retort. No clever pivot. The control room, usually buzzing with instructions, was frozen in stunned disbelief. Vance leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Anything else? Holbrook swallowed, forcing a weak smile. I think we're out of time. Vance nodded. Thought so. The screen faded to commercial. But the damage was done. Across America, viewers had witnessed something rare. A politician who didn't stammer, who didn't backpedal, who stood his ground and left a seasoned journalist speechless. And in that moment, many realized this wasn't just another vice president. This was a man who meant business.